Everyone, my name is Evan Rutter. I'm the Assistant Vice President for Alumni and Parent Engagement. You are seeing that we are recording this. That way those that can't join us can potentially enjoy this conversation next week or into the future. It's a thrill to have all of you here. I hope wherever you are, you're safe, you're healthy. I know we have people from all over the US, plus Canada and Mexico. So it should be a lively discussion and conversation with Professor Taw here. It's a very somber moment for us that are working here in Claremont. Tomorrow is supposed to be the commencement exercises for the class of 2020. As you all know, 9 weeks ago, we sent all of our students home, had an extended spring break, and then they all went to learn virtually. I was speaking with Professor Taw about her virtual classes, and in many ways it worked very well, and in some ways it didn't work as well as hoped, but it sounded like the students really could focus on conversations and guest speakers and breakout rooms and really got a very not exact CMC experience, but a similar one. So Professor Taw, thank you for doing whatever you can do to make that work. If you have joined recently, please put your name, class year, parent year, and where you're currently residing into the chat feature. That way we know who you are and we can just see where we're all currently from. A few Zoom etiquette pieces. If you look at the bottom of Zoom, there's both a chat and a participant section. If you click on the chat feature, it opens up the chat function to the right. You can send a message to me. You can send a message to other people, to the whole group. That's one of the ways I'll be doing Q&A when we get to that later on in the talk. If you click on the participants section, it'll actually pop up everyone's names that are here. There's also a feature that says raise hand. If you raise your hand through that feature, I will call on you during the Q&A portion. I'll unmute you and you can ask Professor Taw your question directly. Otherwise, in the chat feature, I'll ask it for you unless you say I'd really like to ask the question myself. So in honor of our class of 2020, we're doing a very special Mark the Moment program for them. The college and the Alumni Association sent them all a care package and also a very special video for them about their time at CMC. We're also doing a quick fundraising campaign for the class of 2020. So if you have a moment, if you haven't given your gift yet or you just want to support them a little bit more, go to cmc.edu/donate and make a gift of $20.20 in honor of the class of 2020. We're planning on sending them a communication about all of the amazing people that have supported them over their time at CMC, and we'll include those that have donated as well. Without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce Professor Jenny Taw, while also being affiliated with the Keck Institute for International and Strategic Studies. Professor Taw is the Associate Professor of Government here at the college. Her focus has been on American foreign policy, conflict, defense policy, and international relations theory, amongst other things. She's also a very prolific poster on international relations, U.S. foreign policy, and security studies on all things Facebook related. So do friend her on Facebook and you'll be up to speed on all kinds of things. So without further ado, I hand it over to Professor Taw.
Thank you, Evan. And first of all, just looking at the list of participants, I can't tell you, verklempt is how I feel. There are so many people here whom I adore and whom I miss tremendously. And just seeing your names and knowing that you're kind of connected through this is making me feel extraordinarily emotional, honestly. And I hope you're all well, and I'm glad to kind of see you. And there are people here from far more than, we have people here from Europe, people here from Africa right now, people here from the Middle East, and thank you all for being here. So the other thing that I wanted to start with is that I'm very grateful to have this opportunity to talk to you. I do want to make a quick warning for Nick Paris, who's here as well. He was in my security studies class this semester, and this is all going to be very familiar. So Nick, if you get bored and leave, I won't hold it against you. All right, so I was asked to give a talk today, and I had been, as Nick knows well, talking about pandemics in my security studies class this semester, and I thought that would be a good thing to reprise because, you know, we're having a little pandemic right now. And the way I prefaced it in my class is that I've been teaching about pandemics now for over a decade, and nobody should be surprised at the circumstances in which we find ourselves. And so I want to very quickly just give a little bit of context and then talk about pandemics that we've faced and kind of the security components of them. First of all, the definition of a pandemic, if you haven't come across it, is an outbreak of an infectious disease If it's contained within a country, it's an epidemic, but if it spreads worldwide, or at least across a broad swath of the world, it's considered a pandemic. And the World Health Organization describes a pandemic as a new disease that emerges, infects humans, and causes serious illnesses, and spreads easily and sustainably. And I'll describe what easily and sustainably means in just a minute. So things to keep in mind. The first one is, just for a little context, 4 years ago, the National Defense University came out as a guest of the Keck Center here at CMC, and we ran a simulation for students on pandemics. And the simulation was extraordinarily similar to the circumstances in which we find ourselves today. 3 years ago, one of my ROTC students in my security studies class chose to write about pandemics as his subject for what is the greatest threat to the international community. And his paper was extraordinarily persuasive, and many of the things that he noted are pertaining today. In the interim, we saw SARS emerge, MERS emerge, Ebola. All of this to say, no one should have been surprised, and the United States and the international community could easily have been far more prepared than they were for the pandemic when it did pop up. The problem is that preparation for something like a pandemic is constrained by several factors. Oh, by the way, I see parents out there too of current students, and I just want to say hi. Current factors include, for example, well, let's start with what you need to prepare. First of all, to prepare for a pandemic is to redirect resources from something else, because preparation is effectively a zero-sum game. Do you buy more nuclear weapons? Do you outfit another aircraft carrier? Or do you prepare for a pandemic? These are things where there are cost-benefit analyses that come into play. You also have a risk assessment-based undertaking to decide whether or not you prepare for this and how you do. You have to decide what's going to kill the most people, what's most likely to happen and what's least likely to happen. What kind of event will have the most downstream effects, and what are we most able to respond to effectively, to prepare for effectively, to mitigate, and to prevent. And so all of those kinds of determinations go into whether or not we prepare for a pandemic as well. And then finally, there is the political factor, which in this case is enormous. What are people most afraid of? Turns out pandemic used to be pretty low on the list. Where do they, in fact, today it remains relatively low on the list, as we see with events in Michigan. Where do they most want their defense and security resources and attention focused? What generates the most public appreciation? Is preparation consistent with a given political party's or political organization's tenets or priorities or agenda? All of these things also come into play. So what happens is that there have been really impressive pandemic preparation plans in place in the past. I had a friend, a former RAND colleague, who worked on pandemic preparation with a domestic organization that ensured that there was coordination from the federal level to the state level to the local level, where every first responder knew what they needed to do in the event of a pandemic. There was a checklist that you would know what you would need to do if it ever came to having to lock down or close an area, if you had to quarantine, if you had to redistribute food or medication. You had in that plan preparation for getting vaccines started and up and running as quickly as possible. All of that was understood to be necessary and had been planned for. That was scrapped. Subsequently, other administrations came in and put other kinds of plans in place. It's not that people don't know what to do, it's that there has to be adequate attention to doing it. There have also been offices tasked with doing this that have been shut down. There have been stockpiles created and then dispersed. California had an enormous stockpile in the past, and it wasn't maintained because the cost of maintenance was so high. And there have been cooperative international agreements built specifically for pandemics. And it's been a lot of different organizations, not just WHO, but also veterinary organizations and organizations that are focused on the distribution of medications. A lot of people have spent a lot of time figuring out what needs to be done. Whether it's done, however, has turned out to be a more political kind of a decision. All right, so in 2009, I wrote a lecture on pandemics, and I'm going to kind of discuss today's pandemic in light of that, so we can talk about how our understanding of pandemics needs to be updated. First, I want to talk about what makes a really good pandemic. You need a disease that's very lethal. It should kill you, right? You need to have a certain proportion of the population that's infected die. By this measure, COVID-19 is not a very lethal pandemic. Millions of people could die, and without the kinds of measures that are being put in place, millions and millions of people would, but it's still infecting between 2.5% and 5% of the people who are being infected are dying from it. So lethality, this isn't that lethal. Sustainability, this is the ability of the disease to remain alive long enough to transmit. This is such a sustainable disease. This one has tremendous sustainability. Not only does it sit quietly in people without being identified so that they can transmit it to all kinds of other people before they even know they have it, but it also can be transmitted on surfaces by through the air. It can be transmitted in water droplets that are left after someone's spoken and walked away. This is a very sustainable disease, and it lasts a good long time in order to ensure that it will continue. And the last thing we look at is efficiency, which is how easily does this disease transmit. So for example, HIV/AIDS is not very efficient because it has to transmit through very specific bodily fluids that are not easily encountered if you're walking past people in the street, for example. This, in contrast, is very readily transmitted. So it's a very efficient disease. This is why we are all being asked now to wear masks, not just to protect ourselves, for which they're relatively useless, but to protect other people from ourselves, because this is something that even if we're speaking as we walk past people, we can transmit this disease to them. So lethality, sustainability, and efficiency is how we measure pandemics. If we're thinking about it kind of comparatively, in terms of lethality, Ebola, hugely lethal. There's a very high proportion of people who die if they're infected with Ebola. And that used to be true of HIV/AIDS as well. SARS, not so lethal. Sustainability, this is one of the most sustainable diseases that we've seen. This is a very, very sustainable disease, and efficiency, COVID-19 also very efficient, whereas HIV/AIDS was not very efficient. SARS and MERS actually were quite efficient, but they didn't measure high on sustainability and therefore were relatively readily contained. Okay, so one of the things that I want to do just as an aside is mention in this context of lethality, sustainability, and efficiency, why we should feel pretty secure that this was never intended to be a bioweapon. Because this would have been the stupidest bioweapon ever. A bioweapon is intended to infect your enemy's population and kill as many of them as possible with the least risk to yourself. So you actually want it to be quickly lethal. You want it to be only very briefly sustainable, and it should be incredibly efficient. We meet all of this, we meet the efficiency standard for COVID-19, but it's far too sustainable, meaning that it could be transmitted back to your own population, and it's not quickly enough lethal nor lethal enough to affect a foreign population in a way that could achieve strategic effects. And so the people who are concerned that this was intended to be a bioweapon, if it were, it was a pretty lousy one. All right, so we're gonna go really quickly through other pandemics in history, because of course there have been many. During the Peloponnesian War, there was a plague that spread from Ethiopia up into Greece. This was a very, very lethal pandemic. People died within a week. There were very few survivors, and those who did had lost their sight. In many cases, their genitals and digits were compromised, their memory was compromised. By the end, in Greece, a third of the Athenian population was killed. It was a pretty hideous disease. The Antonine Plague, which was a smallpox plague that hit Rome in 165 AD, was spread by its army as it returned. This, by the way, is really worth keeping in mind, that there's a very strong connection between pandemics and more traditional security concerns. And it can go both ways. So militaries can be infected and bring pandemics home. Pandemics can coincide with war, as we saw with World War I. And then pandemics can cause more traditional security concerns, as we're seeing, for example, with Colombia militarizing its border with Brazil right now in order to try to keep Brazilians out of Colombia for fear that the Brazilians will have been infected. In 541 AD, there was a bubonic plague in Constantinople. As you know, bubonic plague is carried by fleas, and in fact, we have it in the mountains up above Los Angeles. Our squirrels are bubonic plague infected, but today it's a relatively easy disease to cure, fortunately. The Black Death spread throughout Europe in 1347 AD, and this is the one you know from the plague doctor mask that's become so famous. It looks like a crow. That was actually quite interestingly similar to this one in that it followed the same Silk Road path. It went from China into Iran and then into Italy. 25 million Europeans died of the disease. I don't have the numbers for those who died in Asia and along the way. Pretty much every generation until the 1700s, so for 400 years, the Black Death continued to break out, but it was ultimately controlled. In the late 1700s, this killed over 137 million people across the world. We have had many cholera pandemics. I won't go through them all. And of course, you're hearing a lot about the 1918 Spanish flu, one of the first coronaviruses to spread around the world. That one killed 25 million people worldwide in only 6 months. A fifth of the world's population was infected. And by the end, 40 million people had died. Okay, so in addition to lethality and sustainability and efficiency making for good pandemics, there are also other things that contribute. First of all, urbanization is really good for a pandemic. Having a lot of people crowded together makes pandemics work really well, as we see in New York, for example, right now. Los Angeles is not nearly as infected, partly because Los Angeles people are spread out. They're traveling more by car than by subway or by walking. And so urbanization is huge for spreading pandemics, as are crowds. Filth, a compromised sewage system, inadequate water. We're seeing right now, for example, on the Native American reservations here in the US, that inadequate access to water is allowing the pandemic to spread quite lethally in those areas. Shortages of water, contaminated water issues. Warmth contributes to pandemics. So there's a link between climate change and the likelihood of pandemics insofar as the more heat you have. And I know people have been saying, well, if we have a nice hot summer, it'll kill all of this. It's not happening. The pandemic went through Australia. The pandemic is going through countries in Africa that are far warmer than anything that we can expect to experience, and the germs are not dying. Proximity to wild animals is crucial, and we know that this one appears to have started in a wet market in China and Wuhan. The more that humans creep up on animal habitats, the more that animals are forced to live closer to each other and to people, the more likely we can expect this kind of disease to unfold. And this is going to be exacerbated if you have a lot of livestock near wild animals. And then finally, globalization. And we'll talk about that again in a little bit. So in 2009, when I first wrote this lecture, one of the things I noted is that the only real pandemic at the time was HIV/AIDS. And one of the things you notice today is that we don't even talk about HIV/AIDS as a pandemic. We don't use it in those terms, and I'll talk about that briefly. SARS since then, MERS since then, we saw bird flu and other kinds of influenza. But really, we were only talking in 2009 about some concern about man-made pandemics and then HIV/AIDS. So I want to look at HIV/AIDS really quickly just because overlooking it, I think, is problematic. It emerged in Uganda in 1978. Again, animal to human transmission. By 2009, 40.3 million people had been infected. By 1997, it was only half that number. And in 2018, in the year 2018 alone, almost 40 million people were infected and 770,000 people died in 2018 alone. By 2018, 32 million people worldwide had died since the beginning of the HIV/AIDS related crisis. And yeah, so one of the things about HIV/AIDS that I think makes it less referred to is that it affected very specific populations. It affected, in the United States, primarily gay population and drug users. It affected Africa and parts, island states in terrible, terrible ways. And then it spread up into Southeast Asia and up into Russia subsequent to that, through primarily prostitution and drug abuse. The way that HIV/AIDS spread and the populations it affected led there to be stigma attached to the disease, stigma that prevented the kind of massive international mobilization that we've seen in response to this. The assumption initially was that people who got HIV/AIDS had earned it, that it was a product of their behavior, that if they weren't using the drugs or if they weren't having gay sex, then we shouldn't be concerned. And the fact that it spread throughout Africa also was stigmatized, where Europeans and Americans initially considered it as a third world disease. This is something that we see, in which we see the politics of pandemics, in which we see the international response being driven in large part by the filters through which we understand a disease, its spread, and its victims. And so I just wanted to talk about HIV/AIDS really briefly because it was so deadly. It remains deadly. It continues uncontained in large parts of Africa to this day. There are lots of populations in Africa that have no access to the kinds of drugs that have made HIV/AIDS relatively safe now in the United States and in much of Europe. And it continues to be a deadly disease worldwide, and yet we don't hear about it nearly as much. A little bit that I also wanted to note with respect to pandemics is that this filter pertains in more ways than just who the victims are or the nature of the disease. So for example, we think about September 11th all the time. Here in the United States, that is a touchstone that pivoted our entire foreign policy for over a decade and had huge implications for global politics. But on that day, more people died worldwide of AIDS than they did in the collapse of the towers and in the Pentagon attack. It's just worth noting that the way that we think about death, the way that we think about the threat of death, the way we think about security is so filtered and often unconsciously through our understanding of the world and through the things we value that often we will not even be aware of the bigger threats that are facing us because of the things upon which we prefer to focus. In 2009, 8,500 people a day were dying of AIDS. That was 6 people a minute. More than 80% of the AIDS deaths were in Africa. There were lots of forecasts at the time that 55 million people in Africa would be dead from AIDS by 2020 if the current trends continued. That proved not to be the case. The numbers are about half that. And the forecast also predicted about 40 million AIDS orphans in Africa by 2010. The numbers reached about a third of that at 14 million children who were orphaned by AIDS throughout Africa. The fact that the numbers were not as high as anticipated was in large part a response to a global community that finally did mobilize to President George W. Bush's PEPFAR program, which brought a tremendous focus on preventing the spread of AIDS and treating AIDS victims worldwide, but particularly in Africa. It ended up having an enormous effect and demonstrated that once people did mobilize, there could be huge improvements, not fixed, but better. It's worth pointing out that there were many implications of the HIV/AIDS pandemic that we're going to see happen again today. There are ripple effects to a pandemic. In Africa, during HIV/AIDS, there actually was a reversal of the population growth, where it started going into negative numbers for a period of years. Women were killed by HIV/AIDS disproportionately. Interestingly, COVID-19 appears to be killing men disproportionately. HIV/AIDS killed young people, mostly between 18 and 35, whereas COVID-19 is disproportionately killing people who are much older, 55 and older. And so the implications of COVID-19 versus HIV/AIDS are going to be different, partly because the demographic effects are different. At the same time, what you did see was economic, security, political, and societal effects that had rippled both within the countries that were infected and internationally. And we're already beginning to see the economic and social effects of COVID-19, and we're likely going to see some pretty serious security effects as well, very similar to the throwing up of border defenses that we're seeing both in the US and between Colombia and Brazil right now. All right, so when I wrote this lecture 11 years ago, one of the things that was being predicted was an influenza pandemic. There are 3 types of flu. C viruses, as you know, are mild. B viruses can cause epidemics, but they don't tend to become pandemics. It's the A viruses that we tend to be afraid of. These are ones that make a dramatic change or shift into a new form of a virus, a novel virus, which is what we're having today. And the effect of the virus depend on exactly what we talked about: lethality, efficiency, and sustainability. And it's these A viruses that go through the animal to animal, animal to human, then human to human transmissions. Bird flu was this type of a virus, avian influenza, and it surfaced in Asia in 1997 and again in 1999. In both cases, relatively few people died, but this, thank goodness, because this is a flu that was incredibly lethal. It killed over 50% of the people who were infected. So fortunately, transmission was much more difficult, sustainability was less, but lethality was incredibly high. SARS, which is also an acute respiratory syndrome, also first emerged in Asia. It spread to over 24 countries. Eventually, 8,000 people were infected with it, but fewer than 1,000 people, fortunately, died. This is another one that was transmitted by close person-to-person contact. I'm not going to talk about any of the other diseases. I'll leave that for Q&A, since I can tell I've already talked for a half an hour. I don't know how that happened. But I do want to mention a few other things. First, globalization can speed pandemics, as we know. Any new disease is considered 18 hours away based on the speed of international travel. So once it surfaced in Wuhan, there was basically no doubt that it was going to spread around the world. It is also, however, true that globalization helps or should help speed responses to pandemics. So one of the things that we talk about in my class all the time is, you know, what is it that will mobilize people to bring them together and unify them in the face of a shared threat? And I always think about Independence Day and aliens, and I think about the Watchmen and the giant squids, and there's like all kinds of things that we hypothesize are going to bring us together so that we'll fight a shared threat. And it turns out that COVID-19 isn't one of them, which I find astonishing. So rather than coming together, what we're watching is a withdrawal from international cooperation, such that we are not maximizing our potential to combat this disease. The other thing to keep in mind is that pandemics are considered equal opportunity threats, and of course COVID-19 could infect any one of us, but their effects are usually disproportionate. And as we're seeing in the United States, communities of color are being hit far worse than other communities. The death rate, the lethality in those communities is higher for a range of reasons. This is related to wealth and development, the environment. If you live in a community that has worse air quality, for example, the likelihood of being infected and then dying from the disease turns out to be higher. Completely counterintuitively, if you're a smoker, it looks like it's lower. I can't explain. But in any event, globalization should provide us with a means of responding effectively, but does not always do so, and we're seeing that it's not doing so now. So what's the best thing to do in light of a pandemic? Well, the first thing is you want to prevent it. It's best to prevent it. You want to reduce exposure. You want to have quick response and early warnings. You want to raise awareness. You want people to be vaccinated, and you want to maximize good sanitation. And I don't have to walk you through each of those and how political they are and how variable our ability to prevent pandemics is going to be, based on the variability in our ability to make these things happen. Inoculation alone, vaccinating people has become itself a politicized challenge, and we're seeing that even in our own country. In addition to preventing, you want to prepare. You want to build and maintain an early warning system. You want to contain outbreaks. You want to build a capacity to respond, having medical personnel trained, having first responders identified. You want to coordinate global scientific research and development, and you want to have all of your responses coordinated and planned out in advance. And again, as we mentioned at the beginning of the talk, not all of that's happened. I can talk to you about who is charged with fighting pandemics, but I think I'll just leave you with the sad case of Turkmenistan. So Turkmenistan used to be run by a man named Turkmenbashi. He named himself that, basically king or god of Turkmenistan. Turkmenbashi was an unusual dude. Kim Jong-un is very similar to Turkmenbashi in many ways. Turkmenbashi created a giant golden statue to himself that turned with the sun so that the sun would always be on his face. He did a lot of interesting things. His real name was Niyazov. Anyway, one of his decisions was when the country was hit by HIV/AIDS and the plague and cholera, Turkmenistan not a very healthy place. When it was hit with these things, what he decided the best response would be to outlaw them. So he did. He made them illegal. And so he decided, you know what, we have plague, cool, it's illegal. Can't tell anyone you have the plague because you'll be breaking the law. He also kicked all the foreign doctors and nurses out of the country so that nobody could be told about the diseases that were rampaging through his population. And he ended up creating a threat, of course, not only to his own population, but to neighboring states, which then had to respond by closing their borders and not allowing the folks from Turkmenistan to come in. All right, so on that sad note and a note of warning that maybe that's not the best way to respond to a pandemic, let me open it up for questions.
All right, the first person to raise his hand was Art Dodd. Art, you want to ask your question?
Yeah, thank you. So, Professor Taw, let's say you have an upcoming sabbatical and you want to try your hand at fiction in a George Smiley or a Jack Ryan character. How would you outline a vaccine, holy grail, 21st century COVID-19 pursuit for an outline for a fiction piece on vaccination and the vaccine development?
Yeah, I was actually thinking about a question very similar to that today, because I was thinking, wouldn't it be fun to kind of create a counter narrative over social media that made people all want to actually vaccinate themselves? And it could be ridiculous, just like the anti-vaxxers narrative is. It would just have to hit on all the touch points that mobilize people. So if I could create this like wacky narrative that would get people running to their local caregivers to get vaccinated, then that would be ideal. And I was actually thinking about today, how could you create that kind of a wacky social media pro-vaccination narrative? It's a good question.
All right, next question, go to the chat, and then we'll have Mark Schwartz after that. From Ken Gilbert in Dallas. Could you please talk about the findings from the NDU pandemic exercise at CMC that you mentioned and how those results compare with what we are seeing now?
Yeah, that was really fun. And what's interesting is that the findings differed from one group to another. So we split into two groups, and each was tasked with kind of resolving a pandemic. And one group immediately became mired down in competitive politics. We had a couple of MUN students in there, young freshmen who were just, really raring to go. And they went immediately to war with each other. And they ended up being completely unable to respond to the pandemic. And by the end of the exercise, they hadn't even made it through, basically the first third of the things that they should have accomplished. The other group turned out to be made up of far more senior students, juniors and seniors who were already that much wiser, and they coordinated and they worked together, and their pandemic response, albeit imperfect, at least hit on the things that needed to be hit on, and it was notably not politicized, which I think was where it turned out to be far more successful.
All right, next up we have Mark Schwartz. Mark, I'm going to unmute you. Go ahead and ask your question.
Thank you, Professor Taw. My question is somewhat related to your earlier remarks about the work I think you and a colleague did at the RAND Corporation, preparing these different checklists that I think you said got thrown out. And so the question is, how would this response have been different if those tools, those checklists, had been available to the current administration and followed or modified?
Right. So your question actually has two parts. So had the current administration been presented with that checklist, it would have thrown them out because the checklist actually wanted a federal-led response. It wanted the government at the national level to basically lead all the states and coordinate a response from the federal level to the state level and then down into localities. Within that, however, there was an expectation and an understanding that each state knew best how its population was distributed. Each locality knew best where its old folks were, where its most vulnerable elements of the population were, how its school day went. And so they were tasked then with the nitty-gritty of implementing the national level policy. So would this administration have used that? No. But would it have allowed for effective coordination? Yes.
All right, we have a question from Jonathan Medina, class of 06. He used air quotes, so I had to put them in there. How did the experts get the easy stuff so wrong? Masks are cheap and effective enough to warrant their use. Why is the WHO recommending them still? Jonathan quotes that he uses eye goggles for yard work. They're also very cheap. Most viruses can infect proteins in and around the eye. Why aren't goggles also recommended as well as a mask?
Yeah, this is a really good question. And it's one of the reasons that people, I mean, among others, that people right now are so critical of WHO. It looks like WHO made the decision about masks with the anticipation that there were not going to be enough available, that when it became evident that people were going to be hoarding and that masks might not be available for medical personnel and first responders, the concern became discouraging the population. This is a lot like your question, right? How do you create a counter narrative? In this case, the counter narrative was masks don't work, so the public wouldn't go out and use them. The problem, of course, being that, of course, it's better if we each have them. And once the counter narrative has been created, it's really hard to reverse it. Nobody in my town wants to wear a mask. And they all point to the initial WHO findings to justify the fact that they're going out barefaced. So why was it done? I think it was done in anticipation of hoarding, unfortunately. And the problem is that, you know, we talk about the experts getting it wrong. Lots and lots of experts predicted this. Lots of experts knew how best to respond to this. It's a question of which experts are getting airplay through which organizations at any given time. And that's a political decision. Which, by the way, just to note, one of WHO's major failings in this has been to sideline Taiwan, where Taiwan is not internationally recognized, and therefore the tremendous work that they were able to do has been ignored and kind of rolled into the larger narrative of what China, the PRC, has been doing.
All right, we're going to the hand raise of Hamsa Shrikant.
Hi, Professor Taw. It's good to see you again.
Hi, Hamsa.
So my question was, it seems like global challenges need global solutions. I can't help but extrapolate from this the reaction that we've seen of increasing nationalism and shutting down of borders and people sort of not cooperating at the global level. I can't help but extrapolate that and wonder what this means for our global response to other global issues such as climate change, you know, the nuclear war, any kind of like AI revolution. I wonder if you could speak to that.
Yeah, so I would actually say you've put your finger kind of on the, well, I think the heart of the problem sounds gross if it's your finger, but what you've done is you pointed out like the real issue, right? Is that we were already in a moment of rising nationalism and populism worldwide. We were already in a moment where we were watching an increase in mercantilism, where we were watching the world shift away from globalization as states began to collapse in on themselves and as opportunistic leaders in the US and India and France and Poland and Hungary and Egypt, all around the world, began to create these very effective populist messages in response, going all the way back to 2009 to the economic crisis, the global economic crisis, and then its long-standing effects, and in response to the population mobilization that happened as part of the Arab Spring. And once you got fear generated by those things and populism arose, the likelihood that you would get a unified response instead of this isolated kind of opportunistic nationalist response was really limited, which is incredibly sad. And so we're watching, you know, would-be authoritarians around the world capitalizing on fear of this disease in order to stigmatize populations in their own countries. So if you're African in China, if you're Muslim in India, if you're an immigrant in the US or a lot of Europe, you are going to be bearing the brunt of the blame for disease about which you know, are completely non-responsible. It's nice to see you.
Yeah, thank you. Nice to see you too.
Question from Mr. Cruz. He asks, who are we supposed to listen to when the CDC is being sidelined and politicized and Dr. Fauci is being contradicted? Who should we listen to?
Yeah. So this is what I recommend. There are a few really good websites that provide relatively apolitical, science-based information. SAIS is producing some of these. A couple of universities are producing. Harvard has some really good work coming out. I would actually go straight to the researchers themselves and kind of sidestep politics right now and the things that we're being told through kind of more politicized filters. And I'm happy if you want to send me an email and I can send you links, I'm happy to do that later. I should have prepared them. I'm sorry I didn't.
All right. Andrew Willis asks, if you had to put together a COVID-19 reading list, what would you include?
Oh, yeah. Oh, gosh. Okay. So I have a terrible memory, and the minute you ask me a question like that, it just completely flies out of my head. But I will put together a COVID-19 reading list, and anyone who wants it, I'll give it to you. And there's actually quite a few books on pandemics that are fascinating, and look at them from different perspectives, politically and socially, and kind of their global effect. And I'll put that all on there, and whoever wants it, email me and I'll just share it. Oh, thanks, Brian. Thanks, Evan.
Sure. Next question. Charles Cunningham poses an interesting question. He says, comment about urbanization as a negative factor, New York City versus Tokyo to date as an example.
Yeah, so there are several different things in play, right? So urbanization is just one variable, but you are more likely to have more rapid spread in an urban area. Now, one of the things that you saw was that Tokyo locked down pretty quickly. People in Asia were very quick to wear masks. It was almost universal really rapidly, whereas here it took, probably over a month for people to even begin seriously social distancing, and you're still not seeing masks universally worn. There's also a difference in the amount of control that the population will allow the government to have. So in lots of the Asian countries, including South Korea, the governments were able to impose pretty restrictive policies very quickly. And the populations accepted those with an understanding that in general, they feel like their civil liberties are respected. And so they will accept these kinds of encroachments on their privacy and encroachments on their civil liberties, as long as it's known to be limited for limited duration and related only to the disease. That's something we're not seeing here. In fact, we're seeing people arm themselves and go out in the streets in opposition to those kinds of encroachments on civil liberties.
Caroline Peck asks, what are your thoughts on the broader security implications of the loss of more vulnerable people to the disease?
Hi, Caroline. Yeah. So, we can bring that all the way down to an individual level, right? Because there seems to be this presumption of Darwinism at work here. But what's happening is that people who are least careful are infecting those who are most vulnerable. And it's not that the people who are most vulnerable have put themselves deliberately in that position. But what it means is that people are dying who continue to contribute hugely to their families, to society. And if you, in the bigger security sense, maybe it doesn't play, but in the immediate sense, people who are immunocompromised may also be the best teacher in their school district, or they might be the most important doctor in their hospital, or they might provide support for their grandchildren. You just don't know what it means to lose so many of the people that we're losing. In this country, the conservative number is 80,000 people who have died. And my presumption is that many, many of those people were hugely important to their communities, to their families, and that their loss is a significant loss.
Right. Kate Castenson asks, what are some of the local governance implications of COVID-19 that you're most concerned about, particularly when we think about places that are already experiencing conflict?
Yeah. What I'm really concerned about comes all the way back to kind of Hamza's question, which is that COVID-19 can be used to strike out against communities who are already vulnerable because they're minority communities, because they're stigmatized communities. And we're seeing this happen around the world. We're seeing this happen here as well. It's being used as a justification in the US for not bringing immigrants into the country. It's being used in India for marginalizing further the Muslim community there. It's being used in China to throw African tenants out into the street where they've become homeless, which is just incredibly inhumane and also incredibly self-defeating, because if these people were sick, throwing them into the street may be the worst thing you could possibly do. So we're watching this happen around the world, that this disease is being used to justify inhumane policies that allow governments to create an other that is then stigmatized and victimized. And that's my biggest concern.
Mr. Cruz asks, female leaders, particularly New Zealand or Germany, appear to have responded in a more factual, more science-based manner, acting decisively yet compassionately, and have suffered much lower mortality rates. Are women leaders proving more effective than men in crisis situations?
So this one, like, my gut would be like, yay, that would be awesome if I could say yes. I wish that were true. But I think actually what we're really seeing is that right now, as I mentioned before, we're in a world where certain type of male leaders have risen to prominence. So we're seeing would-be authoritarians in Poland and Hungary. We're seeing them in the Philippines and in Egypt and in Brazil and all over the world. And so although I would like to be able to say, yeah, women rock, I really think that what you're seeing is that the women who have come to prominence in the COVID-19 crisis just aren't authoritarian. And the dudes against whom we're comparing them are exactly the people who shouldn't be in positions of authority in this kind of a crisis.
All right, Sean Sakaguchi writes, do you think that current actions by certain states, especially in the US, that take a zero-sum approach to measures such as PPP, supply chains, exclusive access to vaccine, drug development, et cetera, will result in long-term impacts to the strength of global institutions and US alliances? And can that damage be overcome?
I mean, Sean, you know this as well as I do, right? Not only have we alienated, as a nation, have we alienated allies like Germany and Canada by the US going in and trying to hoard vaccines or nascent vaccines as they're being produced, and PPP and other supplies. But we've also had, because we don't have top-down leadership and the states have been effectively forced to compete with each other for limited global resources, we're watching a free-for-all between the states and between the states and the federal government, which has, kind of swept in certain cases and taken the resources that the states have been able to wrestle up from abroad. Is this going to have global, implications? So two things could happen, right? We could watch it continue to decline as everybody kind of goes to war for access to these resources and competes and, drives a completely irrational distribution. Or we could have a learning curve where people suddenly, come to their senses and realize that this might be the stupidest thing to do and begin to coordinate among themselves like, mature adults. not sure that's going to happen, but it would be awesome.
Right. Kate Ridenour asks, how do you think the economic fallout from COVID will impact geopolitics, particularly as it relates to things like trade disputes and Brexit?
Yeah, so we were already in a bad path, as you know, pretty much everyone here is probably aware. We were in a bubble. We were headed for a more mercantilist set of policies. The US and China's trade war was having spillover effects globally, and the cost of oil has nothing to do with COVID-19 and everything to do with Russia and the Saudis having a competition in which Russia tried to screw the US for a whole range of good reasons. So we have this, like, we already had a pretty dire situation, and the economy was already looking pretty vulnerable. And then you throw this in, and as terrible as COVID-19 is, I think the long-term economic effects are going to be so much worse. I mean, I think we're headed for a depression. So, sorry.
All right. Gary writes, nationalism and the distribution of a vaccine. How will that play out? He's thinking about the contract between the US government and Sanofi.
Yeah. So in fact, one of the things that I just was looking at today is that many developing countries have gone to the United Nations and tried to make a case for a careful, rational, global distribution of vaccines once they're created on the basis of need rather than on the basis of access or wealth. Will that happen? Okay, you're talking literally to one of the bleakest human beings you've ever met. So my guess is no.
Thomas
Okay,
Schalke writes, a number of the factors you mentioned that increase the likelihood of pandemics are correlated with climate change. We're seeing countries prioritize short-term economic recovery at the expense of policies meant to address climate change. What path forward do you see to address both?
So one of the things that you saw, or one of the things that I mentioned when I was doing my We Talk on pandemics is that actually if you prepare for public health more generally, you prepare for pandemics. And one of the ways you prepare for public health more generally is take into account the effects of climate change. You begin to anticipate water shortages, you begin to figure out where you're going to have storms and flooding and where you're going to have fires, and you begin to put into place measures that help prevent those or help move populations away from those or help effectively anticipate climate change effects, thus anticipating public health effects, thus preventing the likelihood that pandemics A, will emerge and B, will be as devastating as they are, in part because you'll have the people who have the skills and knowledge in place to respond to them. But as you say, Thomas, what we do is we tend to prioritize short-term economic benefits. We're watching around the world a shift back towards that, away from kind of the wishful thinking of the Paris Accords. And the likelihood that we're going to have a massive shift in favor of more sustainable practices is relatively limited. Now I say that, but on the upside, it was this week that the US, for a whole range of reasons, none of which had to do with our current administration, but for a whole range of reasons, produced more energy sustainably than through coal. So, you know, we're moving in a positive direction despite ourselves. Will we get there? You know, that would be awesome.
Brian Davidson wants you to think back to your case study with Turkmenistan. What do you think about how pandemics interact with democratic versus authoritarian systems? Obviously, Turkmenistan did not do well, but are authoritarian systems necessarily worse off? China seems to be doing much better after the initial start. Are democratic systems with many veto points at a disadvantage? Yeah,
so interestingly, I don't think it's necessarily has as much to do with the type of governance, democratic versus authoritarian, and more to do with kind of social norms. So in South Korea, for example, it's a very democratic country, but the population was completely open to the government cracking down and enforcing certain strictures that would allow them to combat the virus. In the United States, we have this gorgeous, beautiful, flourishing democracy, but part of the social norms in this country are don't tread on me. And what you're watching is people mobilize against what they perceive as a threat to their civil liberties. This variation across the world has to do, I think, more with the social and political expectations of the population than it has to do with the nature and structure of the government under which they're functioning.
Let me see here. One question just come in from Alexis. Thank you, Professor Taw, from Alexis. I see the smallest strands of positivity emerging from the current COVID world, with some cities, for example, turning over increasing amounts of land to pedestrians. Do you foresee any situations where this will lead to a brighter short-term or mid-term future than we can, I just pulled through it, that we could have predicted a few months ago?
Evan, this is the last answer, right? And then we're shutting down?
Yes.
Okay, so let me shift and try to make this, again, bleakest human you've ever met, most cynical, but let me shift and try to make it as positive as I can as I leave. Alexis, it's a gorgeous question. Here's the thing. As you know, I'm kind of active on Facebook, and on Facebook, I have, hundreds, literally now hundreds of alumni from CMC who are out in the world, and I get to see the kinds of things that they're doing, and they're beautiful. And they're doing real substantive things in the face of this pandemic, trying to make the world better. I have a student who's doing a photography project to show what community in her neighborhood looks like. And I have students who are, distributing their documentary film about immigrants and trying to make sure that it gets out there so that people are more aware of the situation of immigrants in the country. And I have students who are working on distribution of medical supplies so that PPE does get rationally distributed to people it needs to go. And so I always end with this, but it's so true, and it sounds gross and smarmy and, cheesy, but my hope is literally the people that I get to watch, come up through CMC and go back out into the world and do really good things. People who have strong ethical foundations, people who have strong critical thinking skills, and people who have a strong commitment to the society and to the people around them, to public service. And so, yeah, I think there are places that will be brighter in the short term, midterm, and even long term. I just think that it's going to be really rocky getting there.
And I will also thank you, Professor Taw, for your hour today. Really appreciate it. Follow her on social media. We will send out an email with her links that she mentioned, her reading list. Just make sure you've put in the chat feature who you are so we can make sure to email it to you. So please do that. Otherwise, I'll thank all of you on the call for giving CMC your time and your talents, and of course, your financial support over the years to help make sure we educate tomorrow's leaders. With all of that, have a fantastic weekend. Be safe. I will unmute everybody. You can say hi to Professor Taw. Thank you yourself.
Thank you.
Thank you very much,
Evan.
Thank you very much.
Carol.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Professor.
Thank you.
Happy graduation weekend.
Thank you. Hi, Alexis. Oh, I'm so happy to
Very
see you
good.
guys. Hi, Chris. Nice mustache, man.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hi.
Very good.
Thank
Oh,
you.
hello, Art. Yes,
Hi,
good
Kate.
to see you. Adele. Very nice.
Oh, Nora. Bye. Bye, Omar.
We have a great wine tasting this weekend. If anyone wants to join, sign up for the
Bye,
wine tasting by
Michael.
Sunday.
Great group.
What a great group.
Very nice. What an impact you're having on
Hi,
everyone.
Caroline.
Yeah. Goodbye. Have a good weekend.
Bye, everybody.
Thanks, Julia. Thanks for joining us, Pete.
Hi, Will.
Oh, Joel. Joel's here from Denver. Hi, Joel.
Oh, hi, Mrs. Yasukochi.
Hey, Mike.
Bye.
All right. Well, then I'm going to end this. Goodbye. Goodbye. Goodbye, Pete.
Goodbye.
Goodbye, Frank. Bye, Gary.
Be sure to send her information along, okay?
Yeah, we will.
Thank you so
Thanks
much.
all. We'll see you next time.
I very much enjoy these. I'm so happy you're doing them.
Oh, thanks. That's really nice to hear. We're enjoying them too. Okay, bye everyone.